Arrogant CEO ruthlessly evicts a struggling poor family without a second thought. But when he discovers who they really are, he's forced to face some serious consequences. Mr. Barrett sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, the skyline of the city stretching out before him like a kingdom he had conquered. His leather chair creaked as he leaned back, staring intently at the thick file in front of him. The property, a dilapidated apartment building on the outskirts of town, was one of many acquisitions he'd made recently. A small project in the grand scheme of his empire, yet one that held significant potential for redevelopment. He didn't see it as anything more than numbers on a page, another opportunity to increase his wealth. His assistant, a nervous young man named Kyle, hesitated by the door. "Sir, there's a situation with the apartment building on Grove Street. The last tenant, a single mother, hasn't moved out yet. She's asking for a little more time, just until she can find somewhere else to go." Barrett's eyes flicked up from the file, cold and calculating. "How much time?" he asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really care about the answer. "She's requesting a month, sir, just to get her affairs in order. She's got 2 small children." Kyle's voice wavered slightly, as if he expected Barrett to show some shred of humanity. Barrett closed the file with a decisive snap. "She's had more than enough time. I don't care about her personal issues. Business is business, and we don't delay projects because someone can't manage their life." He waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away a fly. "Give her 48 hours. If she's not out by then, have her evicted. No exceptions." Kyle swallowed hard, the weight of the order settling heavily on his shoulders. He nodded, knowing better than to argue with Barrett. "Yes, sir," he mumbled before retreating from the office, leaving Barrett alone with his thoughts. Barrett didn't give the family another thought as he returned to his work. To him, they were just another obstacle, a minor inconvenience in his path to success. He'd built his empire by being ruthless, by cutting out the weak and the unprepared. That's how you survived in the world of high finance, he believed. Compassion was a liability, one he couldn't afford. Meanwhile, across town, Claire sat at her kitchen table, clutching the eviction notice in her trembling hands. Her eyes were red from hours of crying, her heart heavy with the weight of the world. Her 2 children, Emma and Jack, played quietly in the next room, unaware of the storm about to uproot their lives. The thought of dragging them out into the streets with nowhere to go filled her with a sense of despair she hadn't known was possible. She had called the property manager, begged him for more time, explained her situation in detail. But it hadn't mattered. The decision had come from higher up, from someone who didn't know her, who didn't care. She knew that pleading with someone like Mr. Barrett was futile, but she had no other options. She didn't have the money to move, didn't have family who could take them in. The walls of her life were closing in, and there was no escape. When the day came, it was as brutal as Claire had feared. The movers arrived early, their faces expressionless as they packed up what little the family owned. Her children watched, wide-eyed and confused, as their world was dismantled piece by piece. Claire stood on the sidewalk, clutching her children to her heart breaking as she looked at their few belongings scattered across the concrete. People walked by, some glancing at them with pity, others with indifference, but no one stopped to help. For Barrett, it was just another day, another box checked off on his to-do list. He barely noticed when Kyle handed him the final report, confirming that the building was now vacant and ready for redevelopment. He simply nodded, his mind already shifting to the next big deal, the charity gala he was set to attend later that week. The event was poised to be a turning point for his company, an opportunity to secure a partnership that would solidify his position at the top of the corporate ladder. As he looked out over the city that night, Barrett felt nothing but satisfaction. He had built this empire with his own 2 hands, climbed his way to the top, and no one, especially not some struggling single mother, was going to stand in his way. He turned away from the window, the lights of the city fading into the background as he walked back to his desk. There was still work to be done, deals to be made, And Barrett knew one thing for certain. In his world, the strong survived and the weak were left behind. The cold concrete walls of the shelter loomed over Claire as she sat on the thin, worn mattress, her children curled up beside her. The musty smell of old blankets and unwashed bodies filled the air, a constant reminder of their dire situation. She glanced at Sarah and Ben, who had finally fallen asleep after hours of restless tossing and turning. The soft rise and fall of their chests brought Claire a small measure of peace. But it was fleeting. The reality of their homelessness was an ever-present shadow, and no amount of temporary respite could banish it. During the day, Claire would wander the streets with her children, searching for a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. They would visit the library, a place where the kids could lose themselves in books while she tried to figure out their next move. She'd watch them from across the room, her heart aching as they laughed at a story or showed each other pictures, their innocence still intact despite everything. But the moment they stepped outside, the harsh world would crash down on them again, the weight of their situation dragging them back into despair. Sarah, the older of the two, at just 8 years old, had started asking questions. "Mom, when are we going home?" she asked one afternoon, her big brown eyes searching Claire's face for answers she didn't have. Claire's throat tightened, and she forced a smile, trying to mask the fear that gnawed at her insides. "Soon, sweetheart," she whispered, stroking Sarah's hair. "I'm working on it, okay? We'll find a new home." But even as she said it, Claire felt the lie like a knife twisting in her gut. She had no idea when or if they would ever have a home again. Ben, just 5, didn't fully understand what was happening, but he clung to his mother with a newfound intensity. He was always by her side, his small hand gripping hers, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Mommy, are we going to the park today?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Claire's heart broke a little more each time she had to explain that they didn't have the time or that they needed to save the little money they had for food. She hated seeing the disappointment in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he realized they wouldn't be doing the things they used to. Every night as she lay awake in the shelter, Claire would go over her options again and again, but none seemed viable. She had tried to find work, going to countless interviews, but her disheveled appearance and lack of a permanent address worked against her. Employers looked at her with pity or disdain, and she could feel the judgment in their eyes. Her savings, what little she had managed to scrape together before the eviction, had dwindled to almost nothing. Each day brought new challenges, and the constant worry gnawed at her, leaving her exhausted in every possible way. Claire's once unshakable resolve was beginning to crumble. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being able to provide for her children no matter what life threw at them. But now the weight of their situation was crushing her spirit. The pressure to stay positive for Sarah and Ben, to keep a brave face despite the overwhelming despair, was taking its toll. She could feel herself slipping, the desperation seeping into her bones, making it harder to keep going with each passing day. Yet, even in the depths of her despair, Claire knew she couldn't give up. She had to find a way to protect her children, to give them the life they deserved, no matter how impossible it seemed. As she looked at their sleeping faces, she felt a flicker of determination spark within her. She couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now, not ever. Her children were counting on her, and somehow she would find the strength to keep fighting for them, even if she had no idea how they would survive the next day. The evening of the gala arrived with a sense of anticipation that electrified the air. Mr. Barrett stood before the mirror in his penthouse suite, adjusting his tie with a practiced hand. His reflection stared back at him, a man of power, success, and undeniable charm. He had chosen a tailored black tuxedo for the occasion, a symbol of the wealth and status he had meticulously crafted over the years. Tonight was a pivotal moment in his career, a chance to solidify his place among the elite. He knew the stakes were high, but that only fueled his determination. Nothing could derail his plans. The grand venue, a historic mansion nestled in the heart of the city, was aglow with shimmering lights as Barrett's car pulled up to the entrance. The mansion, with its towering columns and sprawling gardens, exuded an old-world charm that spoke of generations of wealth and privilege. Barrett stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the marble steps as he ascended to the grand foyer. Inside, the opulence was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, casting a warm glow over the room, while the scent of fresh roses permeated the air. The elite of society moved gracefully through the space, their laughter and conversation a soft hum in the background. Barrett moved through the crowd with ease, offering a handshake here, a charming smile there. He was in his element, the confident businessman who had mastered the art of making connections. Every greeting was calculated, every conversation a potential opportunity to advance his interests. As he made his way to the bar, he exchanged pleasantries with a rival CEO, their words layered with the subtle competition that always underpinned such interactions. But Barrett wasn't worried. Tonight was his night, and he intended to make the most of it. Despite his outward composure, Barrett couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of curiosity among the guests. Whispers floated through the air. Everyone was talking about the mysterious host. The benefactor who had organized the gala was a figure shrouded in secrecy, known only by their immense influence and wealth. They had never appeared in public, preferring to remain an enigmatic force behind the scenes. Even in the upper echelons of society, where secrets were currency, little was known about this person. Barrett found himself intrigued, though he quickly reminded himself of his primary goal, securing the business deal that would propel him even further up the ladder. As he sipped his whiskey, Barrett kept one eye on the crowd, waiting for any sign of the host's arrival. The suspense was palpable, and the other guests seemed equally on edge, their conversations peppered with speculation. Who could wield such power and still remain so elusive? It was a question that gnawed at Barrett's curiosity, though he quickly pushed it aside. He had no time for distractions. His target for the evening was a tech mogul rumored to be looking for new investment opportunities, and Barrett intended to be at the top of that list. The evening wore on, and still there was no sign of the host. Barrett continued to network, his confidence growing with each successful interaction. The guests, dressed in their finest, sparkled under the lights, and the room buzzed with energy. Barrett's mind, however, was firmly set on his goal. He could feel the deal within his grasp, and the thought of the power it would bring sent a thrill through him. He was close, so close to achieving everything he had worked for. The world, as always, was his for the taking. But even as he reveled in the evening's success, a small voice in the back of Barrett's mind whispered a warning, a reminder that the night was not over yet. He dismissed it, too caught up in the moment to pay attention to such fleeting doubts. After all, he had never failed to get what he wanted. And tonight, like so many nights before, would be no different. The gala was a celebration of his dominance, and nothing could stand in his way. The grand hall fell into a hush as the lights dimmed, signaling the start of the evening's main event. Mr. Barrett found himself caught up in the collective anticipation, the excitement of the guests palpable as they gathered around the ornately decorated stage. The chandeliers above cast a soft golden glow, their light reflecting off the polished surfaces of the room, making everything seem almost ethereal. Barrett stood near the front, a privileged position he had earned through his status, his sharp eyes trained on the velvet curtains that concealed the evening's mysterious host. When Mrs. Evelyn Carlyle stepped forward, the room erupted into polite applause, though it quickly gave way to silence as she began to speak. Barrett's initial reaction was one of mild surprise, tinged with admiration. He had heard of Mrs. Carlyle, of course. Who hadn't? She was a fixture in society, her name synonymous with philanthropy and influence. In her late 70s, she was a regal figure, her silver hair swept back in a style that accentuated her sharp, intelligent eyes. Clad in an elegant gown that spoke of understated wealth, she commanded the room with a presence that few could match. As she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen much and learned more. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone warm but laced with the authority of experience, "tonight we gather not just to celebrate success, but to reflect on the responsibilities that come with it. In our pursuit of wealth, we must never lose sight of the humanity that connects us all." Her words, though spoken softly, hung in the air like a challenge, and Barrett felt a flicker of unease creep up his spine. He tried to focus on the practicalities, his upcoming pitch, the deal he was here to secure, but Mrs. Carlyle's words kept pulling at the edges of his thoughts. She spoke of compassion, of using one's resources to uplift rather than oppress, and each sentence felt like it was directed at him, as if she could see straight through to the core of his ambitions. "Too often," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, "we forget that our power should be used to build, not to destroy. It is our duty to ensure that in our success, we do not trample on those less fortunate." Barrett's confidence, so carefully maintained throughout the evening, began to waver. He found himself clenching his jaw, his mind racing to counter the growing discomfort that her speech was stirring within him. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached, to focus on the bottom line without getting caught up in sentimentality. But there was something about Mrs. Carlyle's words that unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if she was holding up a mirror to his life, and he didn't like the reflection staring back at him. As Mrs. Carlyle continued, Barrett's unease deepened. There was a subtle intensity in her speech, a sense of purpose that made him feel strangely exposed. He could sense the attention of the room shifting, the atmosphere thick with an undercurrent of introspection. Around him, the other guests were nodding in agreement, their expressions serious as they absorbed her message. Barrett tried to brush it off, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. "The deal," he reminded himself. "That's why you're here." But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Carlyle's words were more than just a general admonition. They felt personal, like a direct challenge to his way of life. And then there was something else. Something about Mrs. Carlyle herself that nagged at the edges of his memory. He studied her closely, trying to place the familiarity that seemed to tug at his mind. Her name was well known, but it wasn't just that. There was a deeper connection, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Barrett's thoughts grew increasingly jumbled, his usual clarity clouded by the unsettling mix of admiration and anxiety that Mrs. Carlyle evoked in him. It was as if she was a figure from a past he'd rather forget, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more insistent the feeling became. As her speech drew to a close, Mrs. Carlyle's final words echoed in Barrett's mind, refusing to be dismissed. "True power," she said, her voice unwavering, "lies not in wealth, but in the ability to see beyond it, to understand that every decision we make, every action we take, affects the lives of others in ways we may never fully comprehend." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Barrett barely heard it. He was too caught up in his own thoughts, the seed of doubt that had been planted earlier, now beginning to take root. For the first time in a long while, he felt the uncomfortable sting of self-doubt, a sensation he had long since learned to suppress. Mr. Barrett had been riding the high of the evening until that moment, his mind still buzzing with the echoes of applause and the promise of success. As he was ushered toward Mrs. Carlyle for a more intimate conversation, he felt a familiar surge of confidence. He had faced many powerful individuals in his career and had always managed to charm them with his charisma and business acumen. Tonight would be no different, or so he believed. His mind was already working through the potential pitch, crafting the perfect blend of flattery and logic that he was certain would win her over. Mrs. Carlyle stood by a grand fireplace, its flames casting flickering shadows across her sharp features. She greeted Barrett with a polite smile, though there was a glint in her eyes that unsettled him. "Mr. Barrett," she began, her voice steady and controlled, "I've heard much about you. Your reputation in the business world precedes you." Barrett returned her smile, though he noted that her tone carried none of the warmth he had anticipated. Still, he pressed forward, launching into his carefully prepared introduction, highlighting his achievements and the potential benefits of their collaboration. But as he spoke, he noticed a subtle shift in Mrs. Carlyle's expression. The polite interest she had initially shown began to harden, her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened. Barrett faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered, attributing her reaction to the natural caution of someone in her position. "I understand the need for discretion," he said, aiming to reassure her. "But I assure you, Mrs. Carlyle, that my intentions are aligned with yours. Together, we can make a significant impact." He ended his pitch with what he thought was a winning smile, but it fell flat in the face of Mrs. Carlyle's unyielding gaze. "Impact," she repeated, her voice laced with a quiet intensity that caught Barrett off guard. "Yes, Mr. Barrett, I've been considering the impact of your recent activities, particularly the eviction that took place at one of your properties." Her words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Barrett's confident facade cracked, his smile freezing as he struggled to process what she had just said. He had expected questions about profits, logistics, perhaps even philanthropy, but not this. For a moment, he was at a loss for words, the memory of the eviction flashing through his mind like a distant, insignificant detail suddenly brought into stark focus. He quickly attempted to regain his footing, dismissing the incident with a wave of his hand. "Ah, yes, the eviction. A regrettable but necessary decision, I assure you. The property was due for redevelopment, and unfortunately, these situations are sometimes unavoidable in business. But rest assured, it was handled within the bounds of legality." He forced a smile, hoping to move past the topic, but Mrs. Carlyle's expression remained unchanged, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "I'm not interested in the legality of your actions, Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice cutting through his defense with surgical precision. "What concerns me is the humanity, or rather the lack thereof, that you demonstrated. Did you even consider the lives you were disrupting? The children you left homeless?" Barrett opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The usual justifications he relied on suddenly felt hollow in the face of her accusation. He had built his empire on decisions like these, but never before had he been confronted so directly by the consequences. Then came the blow that knocked the breath out of him. "That family you evicted," Mrs. Carlyle continued, her voice now as icy as her gaze, "is my family. Claire is my daughter. Sarah and Ben are my grandchildren." The room seemed to spin around Barrett as the blood drained from his face. He stared at Mrs. Carlyle, struggling to comprehend the full weight of her words. The very people he had so casually dismissed as collateral damage were intimately connected to the woman who now held his fate in her hands. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over the carefully constructed walls of his self-assurance. Barrett's mind raced, searching for some way to salvage the situation, but every thought felt like a dead end. The gravity of his actions, so easily rationalized before, now crushed him under its weight. He could feel his confidence slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Mrs. Carlyle stood before him, no longer just a potential business partner, but a formidable adversary, one with the power to destroy everything he had worked for. For the first time in his career, Barrett felt truly powerless, a sensation that chilled him to the core. The atmosphere in the grand hall shifted almost instantly after Mrs. Carlyle's revelation. The same crowd that had mingled with Barrett earlier, eager to exchange pleasantries and talk business, now looked at him with a mixture of shock and disdain. Whispers rippled through the room like a rising tide, and Barrett could feel every pair of eyes turning toward him, scrutinizing him in a way that made his skin crawl. His heart pounded in his chest, his confidence evaporating in the face of their collective judgment. He had never felt so exposed, so utterly vulnerable. Mrs. Carlyle's presence commanded the room as she addressed the crowd, her voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "It's easy," she began, her tone measured but laced with disappointment, "to get lost in the pursuit of success. But true success isn't measured by the wealth we accumulate or the power we wield. It's measured by the impact we have on the lives of others, especially those less fortunate than ourselves." She glanced pointedly in Barrett's direction, her gaze piercing through the layers of his carefully constructed persona. He could do nothing but stand there, feeling smaller with each word she spoke. As she continued, the murmurs among the guests grew louder, their eyes darting between Mrs. Carlyle and Barrett. The realization of what he had done and who he had wronged spread like wildfire. People who had once admired him, who had sought his approval, now looked at him as if he were something distasteful, something to be avoided. Barrett's mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation, but he found nothing. His usual tactics, charm, persuasion, power, seemed utterly useless in the face of Mrs. Carlyle's quiet condemnation. "I've seen too many people in positions of power forget that their decisions affect real lives," Mrs. Carlyle continued, her voice rising slightly to ensure that no one missed her point. "Wealth is a tool, not a shield. It should be used to uplift, not to trample. And when we forget that, we risk losing our humanity." Her words, though not explicitly directed at him, felt like 1,000 daggers aimed squarely at Barrett's heart. Each sentence seemed to strip away another layer of his defenses, leaving him exposed and defenseless before the judgment of his peers. Desperation clawed at Barrett's throat as he realized the gravity of his situation. The deal he had been so confident in securing was slipping through his fingers, along with his reputation. He tried to salvage what little he could, forcing himself to approach Mrs. Carlyle with what he hoped was an expression of sincere regret. "Mrs. Carlyle," he began, his voice tight with suppressed panic, "I want to apologize. I never intended—" But she cut him off with a raised hand, her expression unmoved. "Mr. Barrett, apologies are easy. What matters is the actions we take and the consequences we are willing to face for them." Her words were final, leaving no room for rebuttal. The crowd watched the exchange with rapt attention, their gazes heavy with judgment. Barrett could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of their collective scorn pressing down on him until it was nearly unbearable. As he turned away, the murmurs of the crowd followed him, a cacophony of disapproval that echoed in his ears. His steps were heavy as he moved toward the exit, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen in just a few short moments. The grand hall, which had once felt like the stage for his greatest triumph, now seemed like a prison, and all he wanted was to escape the suffocating atmosphere of disappointment and disdain. The humiliation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a deep, gnawing shame that seemed to consume him from the inside out. By the time he reached the exit, Barrett could barely hold his head up. The realization that he had lost not only the deal, but the respect of his peers weighed on him like a leaden cloak. The doors of the mansion closed behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of what had just happened hit him fully. There was no charm, no business acumen that could undo the damage. For the first time in his life, Barrett was truly defeated, and the emptiness that followed him into the darkness was more terrifying than any failure he had ever faced. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of chaos for Mr. Barrett, a stark contrast to the control he once wielded with ease. His phone, once a constant source of notifications and calls from eager clients, now lay silent on his desk, a reminder of how swiftly things had changed. The few calls he did receive were from frantic members of his PR team, desperately trying to manage the damage that had been done. The news of his public humiliation at the hands of Mrs. Carlyle had spread like wildfire, fueling a media frenzy that painted him as the epitome of corporate greed. Headlines screamed of his callousness, his name becoming synonymous with heartlessness. Barrett tried to maintain his composure as the reality of his situation set in, but each day brought new blows to his once unshakable empire. The deal he had been so confident about, the one that was supposed to be the crown jewel in his collection of successes, fell apart almost overnight. His potential partners, wary of the negative press and the growing public backlash, quickly distanced themselves from him. One by one, they withdrew their offers, citing concerns about the impact on their own reputations. Barrett could feel the walls of his business closing in around him, the foundation he had spent years building, crumbling beneath his feet. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout only intensified. Clients began to pull away, their trust in Barrett's judgment shattered. Investors, once eager to throw their money behind his ventures, started to withdraw their support, leaving him scrambling to keep his projects afloat. The arrogance that had once fueled his rise to power now served as a bitter reminder of his downfall. Every decision he had made, every cold calculation, was now being scrutinized under the harsh light of public opinion. The world that had once seemed so firmly within his grasp was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Barrett's personal life fared no better. Friends who had once flocked to his side, eager to bask in the glow of his success, now avoided him like the plague. Colleagues who had once sought his advice and approval turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with someone whose name had become a byword for ruthless ambition. Even those closest to him, the few he had allowed into his inner circle, began to distance themselves, leaving him increasingly isolated. The lavish parties, the exclusive dinners, the constant stream of social invitations, all dried up, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing weight of his mistakes. For the first time in his life, Barrett found himself questioning the very things that had once driven him. The wealth he had amassed, the power he had craved, now felt hollow, empty. The accolades and achievements that had once been his pride now seemed meaningless in the face of the devastation he had caused. He thought of Claire and her children, the lives he had so casually disrupted in his pursuit of success. Their faces haunted him, a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. He wondered how they were faring, whether they had found some semblance of stability, or if they were still struggling because of his decisions. The reflection in the mirror no longer matched the image Barrett had of himself. The confident, powerful man who had once stared back at him was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. The toll of the past weeks showed in the lines etched into his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. He had spent his life chasing after something he now realized had little value, a truth that left him feeling more lost than ever before. The emptiness that had always lurked at the edges of his mind now consumed him, a void that no amount of money or success could fill. Barrett's nights were sleepless, filled with restless pacing and the nagging guilt that gnawed at his conscience. He replayed the events of the gala over and over in his mind, Mrs. Carlyle's words echoing in his ears. The lesson she had imparted, one of integrity, empathy, and the true meaning of wealth, was one he could no longer ignore. The life he had built, the empire he had so ruthlessly expanded, now felt like a prison, trapping him in a cycle of regret and self-doubt. Barrett knew he couldn't continue down this path, but he had no idea how to change, or if it was even possible for someone like him. Mrs. Carlyle sat in her elegant study, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the room's rich mahogany furniture. She had just finished a phone call with a realtor who had helped secure a charming house for Claire and the children. It wasn't the sprawling mansion that Mrs. Carlyle herself lived in, but it was a beautiful, welcoming home in a safe neighborhood, with a backyard where Sarah and Ben could play. As she hung up the phone, a sense of peace settled over her. After weeks of uncertainty and pain, she could finally see a path forward for her daughter and grandchildren. Claire, too, was beginning to feel the weight of their ordeal lift. The house was perfect, a place where they could finally put down roots and start anew. Mrs. Carlyle had also arranged for Claire to meet with a career counselor who helped her secure a job that was not only stable but fulfilling. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. The children had been enrolled in a nearby school, one known for its supportive environment and excellent teachers. Slowly but surely, they were adjusting, the fear and anxiety that had gripped them during those dark days beginning to fade. One evening, as Claire tucked Sarah and Ben into bed, she felt a swell of gratitude. "Mom, do you think we'll stay here forever?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with hope. Claire smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's forehead. "I hope so, sweetie," she replied, her heart full of determination. "We're going to be just fine here." Ben, already half asleep, murmured something incoherent and snuggled deeper into his blankets. Claire kissed both of their foreheads, feeling a deep sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a future for them, one filled with stability and love. Meanwhile, Mr. Barrett was a man lost in the wreckage of his own making. His once unshakable confidence had been shattered, replaced by a gnawing guilt that wouldn't let him rest. The silence of his empty penthouse only amplified his despair. He had always thought of himself as a man of action, but now each day felt like an insurmountable challenge. The image of Claire and her children haunted him, a constant reminder of the lives he had upended. After days of sleepless nights and endless self-recrimination, he realized that he couldn't continue like this. He needed to do something, anything, to try and make things right. Gathering what little courage he had left, Barrett decided to reach out to Mrs. Carlyle. It was a humbling experience, something he had never done before. He wrote and rewrote the message, agonizing over every word, wanting to convey his sincere regret, but also fearing that it wouldn't be enough. When he finally sent it, the waiting was excruciating. Days passed with no response, and Barrett began to lose hope. Then one morning, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was Mrs. Carlyle. She agreed to meet with him, but her tone was clear. This was not a meeting of forgiveness, but one of accountability. The meeting took place at a small private cafe, far from the prying eyes of the public. Mrs. Carlyle arrived first, her posture as regal as ever, but there was a weariness in her eyes that Barrett couldn't ignore. When he entered, he felt an overwhelming wave of shame. He wasn't the powerful CEO now. He was just a man who had done wrong, desperately seeking redemption. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carlyle nodded, her expression unreadable. "I came because I want to understand what you plan to do next, Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice firm. "Words are easy. Actions are what matter." Barrett nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to help," he said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I want to find a way to make things right, not just for Claire and the children, but for others who've been hurt by my actions." Mrs. Carlyle studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deceit. What she saw was a man broken, yet genuine in his desire to change. "If you're serious about this," she said slowly, "then you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to the people you've wronged. This isn't about redemption for you. It's about justice for them." The gravity of her words hit Barrett like a ton of bricks. He realized then that this wouldn't be a simple path, but one filled with hard work and humility. "I understand," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mrs. Carlyle gave a slight nod, a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe doubt, in her eyes. "Then start by helping those who need it most. Use your resources for good, not for your own gain. And remember, this is just the beginning." With that, she stood to leave, pausing only briefly to add, "This isn't about us, Mr. Barrett. It's about them." Mr. Barrett stood in his office, the once pristine space now feeling more like a fortress of solitude than a hub of power. The city skyline stretched out before him, but the view no longer brought him the satisfaction it once did. The meeting with Mrs. Carlyle had left him shaken, but also determined. This was his chance to prove that he was more than the ruthless businessman everyone believed him to be. He had agreed to her challenge, understanding that it wasn't just about making amends, it was about transforming himself into someone worthy of respect. The first step was reaching out to Claire, a task that filled him with trepidation. He knew he couldn't simply throw money at the problem and hope it would disappear. Mrs. Carlyle had made it clear that this was about creating real, lasting change. Barrett spent days consulting with experts in career development and education, gathering the resources needed to help Claire and her children not just survive, but thrive. He arranged for Claire to meet with a career coach who specialized in helping individuals re-enter the workforce after significant setbacks. The coach would help Claire identify her strengths and passions, guiding her toward a career that would be both fulfilling and sustainable. When Barrett finally sat down with Claire, he was struck by how different she seemed from the woman he had so callously disregarded before. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that hadn't been broken by the hardship she'd endured. "Mr. Barrett," she began, her tone polite but guarded, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I hope you understand that this doesn't erase what happened." Barrett nodded, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. "I know," he replied earnestly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to do what I can to help you move forward." Together they discussed the plan he had put together. Claire listened intently as Barrett explained the job training programs he had arranged, as well as the professional network she would have access to. He spoke of opportunities that could lead to a stable career, not just a temporary fix. Barrett could see the skepticism in her eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. "I want to make sure that you have the support you need, long-term," Barrett added, his voice sincere. "This isn't just about making up for what I did. It's about helping you build something better." For Sarah and Ben, Barrett had arranged access to educational programs that would give them a strong foundation for the future. He connected them with mentors and after-school activities that focused on both academic and personal growth. When he met the children, he saw the impact of the trauma they had been through, but he also saw the resilience they had inherited from their mother. Sarah, in particular, seemed wary of him, her young eyes filled with a distrust that pierced Barrett's heart. He knew it would take time for them to trust him, if they ever did, but he was committed to doing whatever it took to help them. As the weeks passed, Barrett threw himself into the task with an intensity that surprised even him. He found himself deeply invested in Claire's progress, checking in regularly to see how she was doing, offering support whenever it was needed. He also began to involve himself in broader initiatives, working to create opportunities for others who had been affected by similar situations. Through these efforts, Barrett started to see the world in a new light. The power he wielded wasn't just a tool for personal gain. It could be a force for good, for meaningful change. The more Barrett immersed himself in this work, the more he began to see a shift in how people viewed him. Colleagues who had distanced themselves began to reach out, cautiously at first, but with growing respect. They saw that Barrett wasn't just trying to repair his image. He was genuinely trying to make a difference. Yet despite the positive changes, Barrett knew that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning, a first step in what would be a long and challenging road. In quiet moments, Barrett would reflect on the path that had brought him here. The arrogance that had once driven him was gone, replaced by a newfound humility. He understood now that real power wasn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. He had taken the first steps toward redemption, but he knew he still had much to prove, to himself, to Claire, to Mrs. Carlyle, and to the world. And for the first time in his life, Barrett felt that he was on the right path, one that led not to personal glory, but to something far more meaningful. As months passed, the fruits of Mr. Barrett's efforts became increasingly evident. Claire, once burdened by the uncertainty of her future, began to flourish in her new role. The job training and professional connections Barrett had facilitated were not just empty gestures. They provided Claire with the tools and confidence she needed to carve out a stable career. She found herself excelling in ways she hadn't imagined possible, her resilience and determination shining through. Every step forward was a reminder that she was reclaiming her life, not just for herself, but for Sarah and Ben as well. The children too were thriving. Sarah's initial wariness toward Barrett gradually softened as she saw the tangible benefits of his support in their lives. Her schoolwork improved, and she began to engage more with her peers, her once guarded demeanor giving way to a budding confidence. Ben, who had been too young to fully understand the chaos that had upended their lives, found joy in the after-school programs Barrett had helped arrange. The structure and care provided by these activities gave him a sense of security that had been missing for so long. The change in the children was profound. They were no longer merely surviving, they were beginning to truly live. Claire's view of Barrett also started to shift. What began as skepticism and guarded interaction slowly evolved into a cautious appreciation. She couldn't deny the sincerity behind his actions, and though the pain of their eviction still lingered, she recognized that he was a different man now. They shared several candid conversations where Barrett opened up about his regrets and the lessons he had learned. These discussions weren't easy, but they were necessary for both of them. Claire saw in Barrett a genuine desire to make amends, not just to her family, but to everyone he had wronged in his pursuit of power. One day, as Barrett visited Claire's home, a place that now radiated warmth and security, he noticed the change in the air. The tension that once defined their interactions had given way to something more trusting, more hopeful. Claire greeted him with a small, genuine smile, and for the first time, he felt a sense of belonging. "You've done a lot for us, Mr. Barrett," she said quietly as they sat together on the porch, watching Sarah and Ben play in the yard. "I can see that you're trying to make things right. I appreciate that. We all do." Barrett felt a wave of relief and humility wash over him. "Please, call me John," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And thank you, Claire. Your forgiveness means more to me than you know." The transformation in Barrett was profound. He no longer viewed his wealth as a means to exert control or flaunt his success. Instead, he saw it as a tool to create meaningful change, to build rather than to tear down. His philanthropic efforts extended far beyond Claire's family. He began investing in community projects, supporting housing initiatives for low-income families, and funding educational programs for underprivileged children. His business decisions, once driven solely by profit margins, were now guided by a sense of responsibility and ethics. The man who had once been the epitome of corporate greed had become a force for good, using his resources to uplift those who needed it most. Despite his progress, Barrett knew that he could never fully erase the harm he had caused. The past was a shadow that would always be there, a reminder of the mistakes he had made. But rather than letting it consume him, he chose to let it guide him. Every day he worked to be better, to do better, understanding that redemption was a lifelong journey. His relationship with Claire and her children deepened, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of the power of second chances. In the end, Barrett discovered that the true measure of wealth wasn't in the balance of his bank accounts or the influence he wielded in boardrooms. It was in the relationships he cultivated, the trust he earned, and the lives he touched. For the first time in his life, he felt truly rich, not in material terms, but in the connection and purpose that filled his days. As he looked toward the future, he did so with a sense of peace, knowing that he was on a path that not only brought him personal fulfillment, but also made the world a better place. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.